everybody, and welcome to the webinar. I'm Mark Schlossberg, your moderator, and thanks for joining us today. We're here in New York where it's a great day, and I hope it's just as nice wherever you are. We have what I think is an interesting presentation and some case studies that I believe will really make you think, so I'm looking forward to it, and I hope you are too. Our webinar today is one of a series of business licensing webinars sponsored by Business Licenses, LLC, entitled How to Identify Gaps in Your Business License Portfolio. And you can view the other webinars in the series in the resources section of our corporate solutions website, businesslicensesolutions.com. And after the webinar today, this webinar will be posted along with the others, and we'll share a link at the end of today's webinar in case you'd like to see this one again or share it with others. So before we get started, a few housekeeping details. For audio quality, we have everybody's audio set to mute. If you have a question, just type it in, and we'll get to as many questions as we can during the webinar. We plan for 45 minutes of presentation and have saved time at the end for questions. And if we can't get to your particular question during the webinar, we'll answer it after the presentation by email. And so we have three presenters from Business Licenses, LLC with us today, all bringing a different point of view. With us is Doug Starr, and Doug has more than 12 years of experience focused on sales tax and business licensing solutions. Hello, Mark. Hey there, Doug. We also have with us Lorraine Cody. Lorraine is an attorney by trade, and she's the Director of Research at Business Licenses, LLC.
Good afternoon, Mark.
Hey there, Lorraine. And last but not least, it's David Singer. David's a licensing specialist and leads audit and gap analysis projects on a daily basis. Hey, Mark. How are you? Doing great, David. And during today's webinar, we have a lot to cover. We're going to cover license portfolio risks, initial license accuracy, defining business products and services, which is much tougher than you might imagine, license oddities, which are really a series of engaging miniature case studies, auditing and determining gaps, verifying your compliance, and how to do that intelligently, tools and processes that you can use, and then we're going to wrap up with some questions. So let's get going with two quick survey questions to help our presenters learn a little bit more about you. So here's question number one, and you should see that popping up on your toolbar. Have you done an audit and gap of your license inventory? And your three choices are yes, no, and audit and gap. What is that exactly? So bring in your answers, and Doug, what would you think? I mean, what's your experience here?
Well, there's a couple of sets of experience. One is in talking to clients out in the marketplace, kind of unprompted. You'll find that a little less than half have typically done an audit and gap of their license portfolio in the last 5 years. When you talk to clients that come to us for help, generally that's a little more skewed. You're finding a much lower percentage have done that audit and gap, which is why they're looking outside for help.
Okay. Okay, so first question, looks like about everybody is in. We have about 60% of you have voted, so I'm just going to give you a few more seconds. Give us your answer, and I'm going to count you down. We'll get ready to close the poll out. 3, 2, and it looks like we have just about everybody in. So moving on to question number 2. And this question is pretty simple but useful for our panelists here. What is your general line of business? Retail, food and beverage, contracting, manufacturing, or if you don't fit into one of those categories, just select other.
Mark, I might add if contracting or consulting, I would consider those to be in the same category. So if you're a consultant of some sort, I'd just go ahead and click contracting or other.
Okay, sounds good. And let's get everybody to weigh in on the question. All right, looking good. We're going to give you just a couple more seconds, and I'm going to count you down. 3, 2, 1. There's some people in at the last second, so we have everybody in. And let's go ahead and I'm going to look at the poll results. And so for question number 1, have you done an audit and gap analysis? We have 39% that have done an audit and gap analysis, 48% have not, and 13% said, audit and gap analysis, what is that? And I have to tell you, for that 13%, we are glad you're here. So Doug, pretty close.
Yeah, it is. It seems to be kind of in line with what we've seen in the market.
Good. And question number 2, what is your general line of business? I have 27% of retail, 23% at food and beverage, and the rest is spread out pretty evenly. So just a little bit of a skew to retail and food and beverage. So a good crowd and a good time to get started. Now, we asked a couple of questions of our audience. So I'm going to start with you, Doug. Now that we've asked our audience questions, these are business licenses. My question for you is, why do we even go through the trouble of doing an audit and gap analysis for business licenses?
Well, Mark, I think this is just kind of an issue of the times right now. There's a growing difficulty in local jurisdictions collecting revenues, meeting their budgets, and you combine that with businesses fighting what seems to be a difficult economy, and it seems to be just a perfect storm for enforcement. And you've got businesses that are having more difficulty paying the fees. You've got licensing authorities who are just hungry for the fees. And so the net result is these licensing authorities are going out and enforcing, even using third parties in many instances, with both sales tax, different kinds of tax, sales tax, property tax, income tax, and even business licenses. The way they get the money is through fines, penalties, interest, etc. And then the way that they get your attention is through business closures or even work stoppages.
Right.
And those are things that have a real hard effect on businesses, but the soft cost of these things is what's even more scary for businesses. If you look at a business who has gone through the public embarrassment of being on an offenders list, having a sign posted on their door, having a chain on their gate, as you see here in the picture, it just creates this bad image for the business, which sometimes is impossible to ever pay back over the years.
Sure.
And then finally, the last thing that happens is that as you get in conflicts with these local governments, it creates a situation where you've used up your equity if you ever need to get a break from that local government in the future. And many businesses are trying to figure out ways to get, tax benefits or deals done with local governments, and you hate to use it up over a business license because you just failed to be on time or do something that required a little attention. The other thing that I think people don't realize as you talk to them is that these kinds of business license gaps can create material risks. I mean, we've worked with clients who have had 7-figure issues associated with privilege tax and gross receipts tax, and then you consider the soft cost that goes along with that. These are huge costs that hit their financials. And finally, I think the thing that you all need to recognize is that proactive resolution, solving the problem before someone else comes to you, is much less costly than when they're in the pilot seat and they've got the controls and can tell you what's going to happen next. So the moral of the story is, all those are bad things. You don't see a list of good things on here. Nobody in the company gets Employee of the Month because they did a good job getting their licenses. The only time licenses get mentioned in a company is when something goes wrong. So we all want them off the radar.
Right. Okay, and those are good points. So, Lorraine, switching over to you, so it's important that the business license portfolio be managed. What are some of the more common issues that you see with business license portfolios?
Well, there's a host of issues. I mean, I think even if you start the whole process off with all your licenses in a row and perfect, they're going to change. Change is the only constant, and your business is going to evolve. You might add new products or services. You may purchase another line of business or another company. You may get rid of part of your business. And these types of changes are going to alter your licensing needs. So you may have started out, thinking, I have a really good grasp on my licensing portfolio. but have you really taken into account the changes that have occurred in your own business? The other types of issues or changes that you need to sort of keep abreast of are whether the licensing laws have changed. Maybe you've been conducting a certain line of business or offering certain products for a certain amount of time, but you don't realize that regulatory authorities have put into effect new laws that now require or change existing licenses. Another issue that's very commonplace and people don't sort of even notice it is renewals that don't get renewed. It is very difficult. Each license, in many instances, especially if you're dealing across different levels of government and different jurisdictions, they have different terms, different renewal processes. Things fall, between the cracks. They get lost under the furniture, and you may no longer have a license where you think you did have one. Part and parcel of that is it's easier for those kind of mistakes to happen when you don't have centralized licensing responsibility, i.e. you don't keep your licenses all in one spreadsheet, which for a lot of larger companies is very difficult to do. So you don't have a core group of people who are responsible for keeping their eye on that particular ball. You may have some sort of staff that was wonderful for the last 10 years, and they have now left the company. So who's picked up their responsibility?
Right.
What happens when Peggy, who always did it, leaves? Who's doing it now? Also, you may have personnel that were intertwined with that license that have left, say qualifiers on contractor licenses. Now you have no qualifier, maybe you didn't even realize it, but your license is invalid or has been suspended. One of the aspects that we sometimes see is that by not keeping track of these changes and these issues, a company can even be over-licensed. It doesn't really sound like a bad thing, but at the same time, it's a waste of money, it's a waste of resources, to the extent that it's the type of license that involves tax registration or reporting and filing. You may be incurring penalties if you've lost track of that license and you're no longer filing.
Okay. So there seems to be a lot of issues to consider. David, you do business licensing every day. How does a company do it right? I mean, give us some idea of best practices for licensing so that a business can do it properly from the start.
Well, the first step in understanding your licensing responsibilities is to find out what jurisdictions the business activities will be conducted in. Are the activities limited to the business locations, or are there some activities that may extend even beyond that? So once you understand the jurisdictions that your business will be conducting business in, you'll also have to have a clear definition of the products and services that your business are offering. Are you a retail business, a manufacturing business, or are you offering some kind of service? And even if you are offering some kind of service, is that associated with some retail as well? Once you're past that point, you can also identify the unique elements that your business may have, and therefore create special licensing responsibilities for you as well. On top of that, on top of the standard licenses, you may have regulated licenses as well, where there is a special authority that would be interested in governing or being responsible for making sure that you are licensed properly based on your specific activities. Some examples are contractors, food retailers, etc. Once you're done with the licensing, there may be other responsibilities as well, like reporting requirements, sending a monthly, yearly report, and that's something that you have to be aware of as well. Setting up business licenses initially also requires you to make sure that you're handling your renewal obligations as well. Whether you have to understand whether the business has to renew the license on a yearly or quarterly basis, and you have to get that set up initially so that you don't miss out on that after.
Okay, so so this is a process. Now, when we talked earlier, you had an interesting story about a telecom infrastructure provider that had a flawed process, and that led to some repercussions. Can you share that with everyone?
Sure. Well, we were recently dealing with a telecommunications provider, like you mentioned, that had expanded their business quite significantly. And part of their growth included leasing out some of the space on their towers to other communications providers. And they had informed us that there are some recent authorities that were sending them letters about the fact that they were out of compliance or needed to obtain a business license where they haven't had that before. And they couldn't understand where this new licensing requirements, these new licensing requirements were coming from.
Mm-hmm.
And what we found was that while in the past their business activities were limited to using the towers for themselves and therefore did not require them to get a business license, now that they were leasing the space out to other communications providers and now generating revenue in various different jurisdictions, they were required now to get business licenses all over. And for them having thousands of towers throughout the United States and not knowing where their exposure was, they didn't even know where to start. And they really had three options at that point. The first option would be to go ahead and get themselves licensed for every tower that they possibly had in every jurisdiction, which obviously would have been very costly and potentially over-licensing them, because we found that there were many places that while they had multiple light towers, for example, they have 20 or 30 towers, they would only need one license for all of those towers. So had they gone ahead and licensed each tower, they would have spent an enormous amount of money and overpaid for that service. The second option was to kind of go the way they had been and not get licensed and just wait for an authority to contact them. And once they were contacted, they would go ahead and get licensed. Obviously, that's not a very good solution because the fees or penalties involved in something like that can be very costly as well. And the third option, obviously, was the audit, to go ahead, identify the licenses that would be required based on their new business activities that they have now started, and make an informed decision about the licenses that they would go ahead and now obtain.
And Mark, I might just add about this client, it was a very interesting case that David was involved in handling as they kind of got down to where the rubber meets the road and figured out what the results of the audit were. David had some fairly helpful recommendations to him that he had researched in helping them combine licenses in a particular jurisdiction under one license so that they weren't filing for multiple licenses and having to pay a bunch of money out. Where in a cursory review, I think someone who was a novice at licensing would have said, hey, I've got 25 towers in this particular jurisdiction, I'm going to license 25 times.
Right.
David licensed once and funneled all the revenue through the one license so that there wasn't this repeated activity going on. So there's little nuances like that someone has to recognize when they do the research and figure out, what the interpretation of the rules are.
Sure. So experience can help. Now, Lorraine, of the steps that David laid out, of being able to define your business and services, that seems fairly straightforward, but I've heard is one of the more difficult aspects of the process. Why is that?
Well, essentially because defining and a really good, precise definition is very important to determining which licenses you need, and it's crucial to the success of any audit and GAAP. I mean, it's a classic case of can't see the forest for the trees. You're involved in the business. You're not in the business of licensing, clearly. So you really need to look at your business with fresh eyes and cut everything down to an elemental level. And ask yourself, what do you sell? What do you service? What do you distribute? Where do you get all these things? Where do your goods come from? How do they get to you? And determine responsibility at each stage. And you need to look beyond your main line of business. If you're a grocery store, you still need to look at your ancillary products or your incidental activities. You need to look at byproducts that your business activity generates, because those may incur some licensing obligations. In today's world, we're finding increasingly that industry lines blur. More and more retailers and other businesses are sort of offering, more goods and services and products, and they're combining things, kind of a one-stop shopping. I can cash a check and wire money or get a piece of pizza at my grocery store. So you really need to look at those different aspects of your business and make sure you're very familiar with them, your supply, your distribution chains, transportation and storage. Make sure you know who's responsible and whether or not you need a license for that activity.
Okay, a good point. Now, with all the recent weather-related events, business seemed to be more focused on disaster preparation and recovery, which takes them into activities that might be outside of the normal business. Recently, you had an issue with a grocery store in California. What happened there?
I'm not exactly sure that they were preparing for a disaster, although I guess if you are a grocery store, anytime your power goes out, it's a disaster because you have,
Sure.
freezers, you have refrigerators, and you need to keep that food fresh. We had a large grocery store in California that had a backup generator, and I'm sure that a lot of businesses have those. What they didn't realize, and what was found on an audit and gap of their licenses, was that they needed a permit for that at both federal, or actually all, federal, state, and local level. And they didn't, we don't sell generators. But anytime you're in a situation where you may have environmental concerns, hazardous waste concerns, that same grocery store didn't realize that for store-cooked foods, they needed a license to dispose of and or recycle cooking oil. So as more and more businesses are trying to insulate themselves from disasters, they're bringing stuff onto their premises, equipment, supplies, that may cause some licensing concerns.
Okay, and that's an interesting story, and I think, David, you have a couple that are kind of similar in that they had unexpected licensing requirements. As you can see on the screen, it happened in Indiana and Alabama with a couple of unique situations. What happened there?
Well, it's just interesting that specifically in Indiana, California, we've found that while many businesses have telecommuting employees, they're not aware that they may need to be licensed for even where their employees are working from home. And in Alabama, while you may be in the unincorporated county areas and not seem to worry about the licensing for the city, for city licensing requirements, if you're within a couple of miles of the city, you may be what they call a police jurisdiction, and therefore required to be licensed by the city by that fact.
And that's an additional jurisdiction.
Correct, and it's not something that you would be aware of.
Wow.
So David, how would somebody find out about that kind of boundary overlap, which seems like a benign, non-city unincorporated area gets stuck with a police jurisdiction? How did you uncover that?
Well, there are a couple of ways. The sheriff's office may have a list of the jurisdictions that are surrounding the radius around the cities of who is required and what cities you need to be licensed with. Or you'd have to start contacting each of the cities that are surrounding you and find out, am I close enough to you in order to obtain a license?
So, David, just keeping the focus on you for a minute, again, you're the process person. You do licensing for a living. So how do we avoid these problems? Tell us how we go about doing a successful license audit.
Well, the first thing that you'd have to do is devote some time and understand that you would have to pull together all your licensing requirements and identify the licenses that your business would need and versus the ones that you may have already. And if you just don't have the time for something like that, you have to hire an expert. Once you've decided that you are going to go ahead and do the research yourself and figure out what licenses that your business would need, the first step would be to pull the list of licenses that your business currently has, if you can get some kind of list together so you can eliminate that later. Once you've done that, you can start doing the research based on the jurisdictions where your business is located and the services you're providing, and identify those licenses that they may require. Once you've figured out that what the licenses are out there and you can match them specifically with your business activities and see which licenses you would need to obtain specifically for your business. You can now match up the licenses that you've found that you need versus the ones that you already know that you have based on your list. Eliminate those, and now you have what we call your gap. Right. The next step is really one of the more difficult parts. I'm not going to get into it right now, but it would be to fill the gaps, and that would be by obtaining a license, however that may take you to do it. The final thing would be to document the steps and the procedures that you've gone through in order to get this whole thing done, because when you have to do that in the future, at least you'll have some notes regarding the steps that you've taken and the procedures that you've done.
Okay, and that makes sense. So I'm going to go back to you, Doug, and talk about gaps. So how do you go about verifying license compliance? I mean, to me, it seems risky to call a jurisdiction and say, hey, am I in compliance? It seems like that's just asking for trouble. Is there a right way to do this?
Well, I mean, your point is spot on, and I think, one of the interesting things today is that in this panel we have, we have someone who actually administrates the licenses, we have someone who gives advice on licenses, and we have someone who helps to create tools and talk people into buying help for licenses. So you're going to have different perspectives on this question. So let me give you the perspective from the guy who's heard what customers say about it.
Okay.
And then, and I don't want anyone to construe this as advice, but this is from the mouths of customers. And you'll certainly, I hope Lorraine will chime in a little bit and make sure to keep us all honest, since she's the attorney in the group. But there's a couple of things that you've got to do that you just can't bend the rules on it. Number one, you want to make sure that you stay anonymous as long as you can, so you keep your options open. And one of the issues for people is that they may not have a license in their list, but the license sounds familiar, or someone before may have licensed it at one time. Those are important elements to the research. So what we would suggest you do is try to figure out if the missing licenses in your portfolio are really required. Have you interpreted the law correctly? And so if you've got to do that, you either got to scour the code and try to determine and make what's right and make sense of it, or you've got to call somebody at the municipality or the jurisdiction and say, hey, if I was going to do this, what kind of license would I need, or would this license be required? But I'd suggest you don't identify yourself quite yet.
Okay.
Secondly, if you can figure out a way to online verify whether or not you really have a license, there are many jurisdictions and opportunities to do that. And I know, Lorraine, you've done that in the past, where you've logged into places where you can actually pull up a list of licenses that people have drawn in that jurisdiction.
It's prevalent in a lot of municipalities for different kinds of licenses. You don't have to create an account. Generally speaking, they will either have a search function, or you can request some sort of roster of licensees. And I would highly recommend that if you think that license is required and you want to see if maybe someone who's in a similar business as you has it, and also whether you've ever had it, since oftentimes it'll be active as well as inactive licenses on that roster. You definitely want to try and get a hold of that, and you don't need to identify yourself to get that.
Okay. And so now what you've done is you've winnowed down the list a little bit of things. Were there licenses that maybe I really didn't need, that at first glance looked like I might, and now there's licenses that I need that look like are missing, but I've looked at the list and found out, oh, actually I did have that license in play right now, or I had it in play a year ago or 2 years ago. Important factors again. So now you kind of get to the moment of truth. And the moment of truth is, am I going to go identify myself to the jurisdiction and kind of fall on my sword for them? Or am I going to just say, you know what, from here forward I want to make sure I'm licensed properly? And there's a couple of issues with that. And again, this is not advice for anybody, but this is what people do. One is, when you go to license initially, there's generally a question that says, when did you start the business activity in this jurisdiction? And so if you're going to answer that honestly, and you've been there for 10 years and you've never been licensed, that's a dilemma for you. You've got to decide whether or not you're going to fill in that box and just prospectively file. On the other hand, you may say, you know what, I've owed it, it's been there forever, it's not that big a deal, this is a flat fee license, there may be some penalties, if I fall on my sword, maybe I can get forgiveness. You may want to consider doing it that way. But you're going to have to weigh what is the cost of compliance and the risk of not being compliant to determine whether you just kind of move forward and are licensed properly, or you go backward and try to repair the past. And Lorraine, I don't know how you would advise somebody to make that decision. I'm guessing you wouldn't.
Well, you and I have had this discussion before. I want to make it clear that we do not advise people to sort of fudge dates or, bear in mind when you fill out an application, you attest to the honesty of that. What Doug and I have talked about in the past, though, is that there's a certain prioritization that should go on there. If you had that license in the past and it simply wasn't renewed or it got lost somewhere, you were compliant at one point, and I think you need to take that into account, and maybe it's more of a reason to call the authority and say, look, I had that license 2 years ago, I let it fall through the cracks, I really apologize, but, please help me now, how do I go forward? I think that's a different situation than having never had a license, and that it should be treated as such.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, the other thing that we've kind of uncovered, both you and David, as you've helped with people kind of remediate issues, is that if you don't have a strategy across a geographic area, whether it's a group of cities or counties or in an entire state, it's like when one domino falls, it seems to be several other dominoes fall. They communicate somehow, and so the advice would be, if you're going to go in and verify your compliance, recognize that if you fess up with one jurisdiction, neighboring jurisdictions may find out, and neighboring in tax types may also find out. So it would not be unusual for you to go into a city, have a problem with the business license, for it to be a home rule state, and for that city to also say, well, let's just do an audit of their sales tax because it looks like they weren't on top of their business license.
Right.
So just be cautious about that you need to create a strategy and follow that strategy, and make sure you're going in with your eyes wide open rather than, oh, now I've opened a can of worms and
right.
It's getting all over the place.
And it should be a complete strategy. You should not do this piecemeal. You should know what licenses are required, know whether or not you had them in the past, and then as your remediation strategy, you have step-by-step. Like, these are the important ones. You really want to look at, say, a municipality that's starting to crack down. If you're missing a license or have let a license lapse in a municipality that's been in the news lately, for vigorously enforcing their licensing laws now, you kind of want to move them up the list. I don't recommend that you start this process without sort of having every step in place and knowing what you're going to do. You don't want to ask a question you don't already know the answer to.
Gotcha.
It's one of those situations.
Right, so you want to have a plan.
Definitely.
Okay.
And Mark, let me end with what I think is the best piece of advice that I've gotten from the likes of Lorraine and David, and that is that when you do have to fess up and you do have to call a jurisdiction, do fall on your sword. Do tell them that I'm trying to do everything right. I'm trying to make sure that I do the right thing with you guys. I'm not trying to avoid anything. I had this license in the past. I need to get this handled properly, and ask for their help. But don't try to wiggle your way out of a problem without at least admitting to them, hey, I made a mistake, but I'm here to fix it.
Yeah.
And be careful that you don't put the onus on them. Like maybe you weren't paying attention, and all of a sudden you're claiming, well, the renewal notice must have gotten lost in the mail, or you didn't send it to me. I can tell you from past experience on a local government level, they hate that.
They do.
Yeah, do not transfer the blame to the authorities. They're not the reason why you don't have the license now or it wasn't renewed.
And now, does that also go with getting advice from an authority? Can you say, well, the clerk told me I needed X, Y, and Z?
It happens that sometimes you get the wrong facts or wrong statements, wrong advice from an authority. Does that insulate you? No, it doesn't. It's really your job to figure out, are you speaking to the correct person? Does this make sense in the context of what the code is or what their rules are, what the license form says? You have to make sure everything lines up. You can't just rely on, Sally, the secretary, said that I don't have to do this. It's not their job, to some extent, to do your license research for you.
So the buck stops with the business.
Always.
Well, there you go. So we've talked a lot about licensing and auditing and making sure you're compliant. And, as you see the bullets on the screen, it all looks pretty easy. But, in reality, somebody has to do the work. and finding the information just seems to be a difficult and time-consuming challenge. So, Doug, without turning this into a full-blown demo, can you give everyone an example of a tool that would make this a bit less burdensome?
I can, and rather than it really being just an example of a tool, it happens to be the tool that the likes of Lorraine and David use internally, that we developed so that we could give people advice like this. We do make it commercially available, but that's not the point today. The point is, I want you guys to kind of get an idea of what you're up against when you go to contact a licensing authority and you make the mistake of not being thorough about the description of your business. So if you look up on the screen, this is a screenshot from our business license management system. And essentially, what this does is it allows you to put in a location, a number of ways you can put it in if you look up there on the left side. And then on the right, you get to search by business activity. So let's just assume I'm a convenience store that's going into Birmingham, Alabama. And I just decide to kind of uncocked go in and talk to some clerk in the city of Birmingham. And I call the clerk and say, hey, I'm getting ready to open up business in Birmingham. What license do I need? Okay. What that clerk heard was, okay, here's some guy who doesn't know much about his business who's now going to ask me to decipher for him from 107 different results, as you can see down here on the screen. So in the database, it tells us there's 107 potential licenses that someone could have, you know, ranging from federal licenses down to local licenses, depending on what kind of business they're in. So now what the person does is they recognize, oh, that's too much to ask a clerk to do for me, and they're going to make a mistake if they advise me. So what they would do instead is say, okay, well, let me try to at least describe what kind of business I'm in for this clerk. I may do it in layman's terms. It may not be very accurate, but at least I'll give them a hint of what I'm in. And so now what I've told them is, oh, you know what, I'm going to be in food and beverage sales. I'm going to have, you know, beer and wine in my liquor store. I'll sell stuff on Sunday. I'll have, you know, tobacco in there and a few other things that I plan to sell out of my store. And so what happens is now the clerk hears in their head, okay, that's better. I've got a better definition of the business. That takes it down to 23 licenses that they might need. And so you've winnowed down the list a little bit, but still, you've probably got some unnecessary licenses there that the clerk's going to be inclined to tell you to have rather than tell you not to have, because they don't want to make the mistake of telling you not to have something you should have. Well, now let's get real specific, and let's just assume that we can say, I know exactly what kind of business I'm in. It's a food mart and a convenience store. I sell alcoholic beverages, lottery tickets, tobacco products, and I'm going to take WIC and food stamps as I go into business. And so what you can see is now the results have been reduced to 18 results. So there's 18 potential licenses that again, you know, run the spectrum of federal licenses down to local licenses, which now become more meaningful for someone who's trying to audit whether or not they're compliant with, you know, their licensing responsibilities. Okay. So this kind of tool really gives someone the ability to say, you know, how do I take this out of the voice box of an uninformed clerk who's been there for about 30 minutes and happened to take my phone call to, you know, a database where I've got all the data at my fingertips and I can make my own decisions and then go in and to some degree coax or coach that clerk into, you know, confirming my advice.
Okay. So in real time, how long does it take to do something like this if you're using a tool?
Well, if you use a tool, it's as quick as identifying your zip code, or with this tool you can even use a geocode, or you can just use a city, county, and it will make some suggestions for you up here on the left. And then, you know, the trickier part is what you heard Lorraine describe earlier, which is having a clear definition of your business, but it's a click-down menu. So you click off the things that you're going to do, starting with a succinct line of business that you're in, and then, you know, the specific products and services underneath it. So, I mean, just to do this was a 3-minute exercise. For
3 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, so if you do this exercise, what about some of the things that David and Lorraine had mentioned, you know, ancillary generators and telecommuting and things like that, police jurisdictions?
Yeah, I mean, those things that we commonly run across are going to be in there. Now, the difficulty is that somebody's going to come up with something in about the next 45 seconds that we're not aware of, and
Right.
so it's not in the database yet. We'll get to it over the course of time, but there's going to be some things where that might get missed over time. But generally, you're going to find those kinds of conditions in the database and be able to sort them through in the process that I just showed you on the screen.
Okay, good. Well, now, as long as I've got you here, Doug, I mean, we've covered a lot of ground in the last 40, 45 minutes, and I'd like to get some questions. So if you could you just wrap this up for us?
Yeah, let's see if I can just kind of give you the key points from what Dave and Lorraine said. I mean, they're the experts, so these are the things you want to take notes on. So the clip notes are just keep in mind that the premise behind this webinar is that non-compliance with business licenses can create operating risk. And you know, in order to minimize that, the things that you've got to do is do your best to license initially the way you should license. And in order to do that properly, you've got to understand your line of business. You've got to be able to delineate your products and services. David suggested that you employ a button-down audit process. I mean, for those of you that saw that slide, we'll make it available, but that's a great checklist for how to manage an audit. And then, you know, the tricky part is researching those licensing requirements thoroughly, using both, you know, resources like the resource I showed you on screen and using the jurisdictions for help. You got to watch for unique rules, regulations, and reporting requirements. You've got to be vigilant about making sure that you found those. And then once you get to a place where you've finally disclosed in your portfolio you've determined what the gaps are, you've got to decide, disclose or not disclose. And, you know, do I approach this thing anonymously and prospectively, or do I disclose and ask for the help and the leniency of the jurisdiction? And then finally, you know, with the last few slides, a great tool saves a lot of time and takes the burden off of this clerk who may not be as familiar with your business as you are.
Okay. Okay. Well, everybody, that's great information, and I hope everybody that's listening in found that useful. We're going to shift gears. We have questions coming in, and I want to get to some of the questions. But first, I wanted everybody to know that as a follow-up, Doug is offering a free research session on that tool, the license determination tool that he showed a moment ago. Is that right, Doug?
Yeah, so I mean, we'd love for anyone who would like to pick a location and you know, kind of do an audit and gap on that single location. We'll walk you through that and coach you through the tool, and then determine, you know, whether or not you've got some license gaps.
Okay, fantastic. So let's get to some questions. If we can't get to your question during the webinar, we'll be sure to address it as soon as the webinar is over. And of course, you can contact Doug, Lorraine, or David directly at the information on your screen. The first question is generating some excitement around the table, and I won't say who it's from, but the question says, I telecommute in Indiana. Tell me more. So this is really an issue for somebody. Do you have more you can add now, David, or do we need to get back with her later?
Well, I mean, some general information that this person should be aware of. It's pretty funny that that's one of the examples that I had to bring up before, but depending on how the business has you set up, whether it's a W-2 employee or a 1099 employee, the business may be required to obtain a license, or you may be required to obtain a license, and it also depends on the jurisdiction itself. You know, the city may require you to obtain a license or not, and it really depends on your specific situation, but it's definitely something to look at.
Okay. We have another one that's come in, and I think we might have covered this before. Maybe we can give a little more clarity on it. But the question is, what happens if a municipal rep advises me incorrectly and I license incorrectly? You want to take that one, David? You want to try that?
Well, if you like we said before, we were talking before, if you were given incorrect information, who is responsible for something like that? And the truth is, each business is responsible for their own licensing, regardless of who it is that they spoke with. What I like to suggest when someone is doing their internal audit and they're not sure of whether or not the information they got is accurate, or even if they are sure, what I like to do is to get the information directly from the authority and keep their contact information and maybe get something in writing so that if I do have an issue later on down the road, I can go back to them and say, not only did I do my due diligence and try to obtain my information from the authorities directly, but this is the response I got, and I got it in writing from this authority. So if there is an issue later on, it can easily be fixed.
Okay. Okay. So, another interesting question. I'm just going to read it as it's written. Your experience with local municipalities being able to impose business license fees based on international and/or out-of-state revenues. So, what experience do we have with that?
Yeah, I think that is a specific enough question that I will try to circle back with the asker on that, because there could be a variety of answers because of the way that question was asked, and I don't want to misadvise somebody or indicate something that leads them down a path that they don't want to follow. So I'll follow up with Ken, is who asked that question. I'll follow up with Ken via email or by phone call to try to help with that.
All right. Shelley has a question, wants to know, when are you going to discuss the tool that identifies gaps in business licenses?
Well, I can discuss that. I mean, one of the things I want to be careful about doing is proselytizing on a call like this, but just to give everybody some insight into the tool, it is an element of our business license management system. We have a library called Lapel, which is the License and Permit Electronic Library. That's got about 140,000 different license applications, pieces of information, codes, pieces of advice, jurisdiction contacts, and et cetera in it. And so what we've done is we've created this what we call the license determination tool, which essentially queries that database and provides the information that's associated with the geography that's been identified in it. It's a relatively inexpensive tool, and I would be glad if someone just wants to grab my email off the screen and shoot me a note. I'd be glad to shoot them a price list or give them a call and walk them through it. The reality is that what we've invited everybody on the call to do is pick a location and let us just kind of demo it for them and walk away with a tangible result that they can use for a location.
Okay. Okay. Good answer. Let's see. Here's a question that I don't know if this is basic or not. Are licenses called the same things from jurisdiction to jurisdiction?
Well, I think the easy answer to that one is no, and if they were, keeping track of your licenses would probably be a whole lot easier. Generally speaking, what's one municipality's business license could be another municipality's privileged tax license, and that's just for basic licenses. I think that as you get into the more regulated licenses, you get more standardization. But beyond that, I don't know, David, correct me if that's not your experience, but
It's the same. There are actually some jurisdictions that call a sales tax account an actual business license. They use it as their business license versus just a general sales tax. So it does differ from jurisdiction to jurisdiction.
Well, it sounds like it could add some confusion.
it does.
Well, and I think the key point to that is that obviously the person asking the question has identified a license in one jurisdiction, has gone to another one, and called it out by name, and someone's given them So the reality is that, again, it's the smooth, clean business definition which will allow somebody that's calling it License A to recognize that in a new jurisdiction it's called License B. So that business definition is key in that.
Okay. Okay. I have another question that came in. This one's interesting. If I acquire another company, would I necessarily have to relicense?
Well, I think that depends on the facts and the types of licenses and the line of business. I mean, it's kind of a general question. There are many licenses that are simply not transferable. They may be contractor licenses, different regulated licenses. For the most part, business registration, business licenses cannot be transferred. They need to be refiled, or some sort of documentation has to be made that ownership has changed. Is this an ownership change? Is it an address change? Is it an officer change? Those types of changes can very often lead to having to come up with new licensure.
Okay. Hey, Mark, I'm going to interrupt because I just got a question that came across too. That I mean, it's great. We've got a government representative.
Oh, yeah, I see that on here, Pam.
Yeah. So, and their question is, they make a good point that while it's the responsibility of the business to know what they're doing, and ignorance of the law isn't an excuse, the government also has a responsibility to help walk people through those things. And that's great to hear, Pam. Thanks for reminding us of that. But the question is, what are good ways of reaching the business community? And I will try to catch up with you offline because we've got some ideas on how we're doing that independently that local governments can also be included in. But and certainly, assisting with the database that people use is another way to get involved.
Sure.
So, Pam, I'll circle back with you later.
Okay. Well, we have a few more. Let's see if we can get to them. The next question is, how often do companies audit their license compliance? Or I guess and that's the question, but I mean, how often should you do it? Maybe that's the question.
Well, Mark, I don't mean to interrupt and take the floor here, but let me answer that question the way it was asked, and then let's have Lorraine and David answer it the way maybe it should have been asked.
Okay. Good.
So I'm not sure if the question was, I want to know how often my peers are doing this.
Right.
If that's the question, then once again, when we looked at this, over half the people have never audited their license database. So those that do audit their license database, what we've typically found is they do it once and kind of feel like that's good for a while and then forget to do it again. Okay. So now maybe I could defer to Lorraine or David and talk about what if you had to give advice on how often someone ought to do it, what would you say?
Well, I'm sure you don't want to hear this answer, but it really would depend on what it is exactly that is going on in your business. If you're adding locations or changing something going on in the structure of your business, you may have to do it more often than others. But if your business has stayed the same throughout, we'd like to recommend that you do an internal audit every few years, so you're aware of any new licensing requirements that are out there, or if there is something that you missed in the last one, you make sure you come across that. And if you missed the renewal, that can also help you as well.
Okay. And let's see, we have another question that's come in that says,
That's a good question.
you like that?
Uh-huh.
You have to call a jurisdiction with a license question. Who should you ask for? What do you call it? You say, hey, let me speak to the boss, or who do you ask for there?
Well, generally speaking, and that's the real trick, is making sure you get someone who knows what they're talking about. You want to do a little bit of prep work before you make that phone call. You want to maybe, if the municipality or authority has a website, you want to go on the website and see, is there a specific department, is there specific contact information, is there even perhaps, hopefully a staff directory, so that are you speaking to, the building official or to a secretary. Not that I haven't seen secretaries that know,
Sure.
Sometimes more than their bosses do, that's for sure. But you want to do a little prep work and try and find out if you know who you're speaking to. If that's not possible, you at least want to have a good grasp of the types of requirements, either from looking at the law or the code, so that you can ask intelligent questions, and you can also make your own determination of, does what they're saying sound accurate? And if it doesn't, maybe you should ask for someone else.
Okay, and that's wise. Let's see here. We have a few more, and we have limited time. We're trying to figure out which one to get to next.
I think either one's fine.
Okay, so I'm going to ask another question from Shelley because she went to the effort of asking two questions. So if work is being done by multiple entities, but only one business license is filed, and all gross receipts are reported under that legal entity, is that not in compliance?
Well, not necessarily. We've had many situations where the same company that was operating from the same location but using multiple entities were required not just to obtain separate licenses but to apply separately for each entity, which would mean if you had 6 or 7 entities operating from the same store or the same bank, for example, not only would you need to apply for each entity, but you would have to apply separately with each EIN or each company name. So just because the actual location is licensed doesn't mean each entity is licensed. So you may have to be careful about that.
Okay.
Yeah, and Mark, we've got a couple of questions up here which kind of result in that same "it depends" answer.
Okay.
There was a question earlier that I saw where people were using third-party sellers. It looked like, I think it was Danielle that asked the question, and they're invoicing from one spot and selling from another.
Right.
And that's an "it depends" question. So that's one. Danielle, we'll circle back with you too to try and see if we can get the specific issue and location and give you a more pertinent answer. But it looks like you got a couple more that have come in.
Oh, yes. This one's from Amanda. How are businesses making sure that they acquire those miscellaneous licenses, I assume for generators and police jurisdictions and telecommuters and things like that, that do not necessarily fall into their normal course of business?
That's a tough question.
It's a tough one, huh?
That's where you have to walk around. I mean, it really sort of depends on what kind of business you're in, but that's, if you're a mom and pop type of business, you need to walk around your facility and look around, say, what do I have here? If you're a larger company, maybe you need to look at different inventories you have of equipment, recently acquired things. Have we acquired new property? Have we acquired new subsidiaries or business activities that may need a license? You need to keep on top of the various changes, and really the only way to keep up with those licenses is to sort of keep track of most things in your business, what you own, what you use.
Let me add to that, because Amanda gave us some perspective on her business. The reality is that when you've got a ton of locations, it's going to be very complicated to do that and own that and keep your arms around it. So I think these are self-serving to a large degree, it's going to sound like, but the best way to do that is to employ an expert who has familiarity with that, or to employ a database that contains it already. And so when you've got a business that's as big as Amanda's, you got to do something different.
Right. Okay. And one more from Shelley. She says, this is my last question, but you can ask all you want, Shelley. You give us great questions. Are there any common jurisdictions that, based on your experience, conduct audits regularly?
That's a good question. We've actually found...
I don't mean to interrupt, but you mentioned Chicago in particular earlier, but keep going.
Well, Chicago itself does audit all types of businesses on a regular basis, and they have a very difficult screening process that they require all businesses to go through. But my specific example was really going to be more in California, where if you register your business at any point, they submit the information to the local jurisdiction where your address is located a lot of times. So if you forget to get one license and you apply for another, it could be that they're sharing information. So you really have to do an audit throughout from your federal, state, county, and local licenses.
That's a good point, because they're communicating. So we have come to the end of our time, and we appreciate the great questions. We always enjoy those at the end of the webinar. And we thank you for being here. Again, our sponsor was Business Licenses, LLC, offering automation consulting and outsourcing solutions for businesses. For a replay of this and other business licensing webinars, you can go to the website, which is businesslicensesolutions.com. Go to the resource tab, and you'll find the webinars there. Thank you for everyone for attending, and check your email. We'll be getting back to you, and Doug will be sending a link back to today's content and also a free session credit for the license determination tool that he showed. So thank you, everybody, and thanks for attending.
All right, thank you, Mark.